Hello everyone, I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. This is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how we can improve our leadership skills by learning from others, drawing lessons from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Arthur, Mark Bowden first came to my attention with Black Hawk Down, a book about 1993 Special Forces debacle in Mogadishu, Somalia, involving the attempted capture of a warlord. I went ahead and looked him up on Wikipedia, and he claims to have been inspired to become a journalist by reading Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. He's written books about the killing of Pablo Escobar, the Colombian drug lord, and Osama bin Laden, as well as countless articles, including a number for The Atlantic. I particularly enjoyed The Dark Art of Interrogation, about enhanced interrogation techniques, and Abraham Lincoln is an Idiot, the difficulty of recognizing excellence in its own time. From Wikipedia, Bowden also holds unconventional views on the future of the media in the 21st century. He doesn't believe attention spans are shortening, and he thinks young people are just as drawn to deep journalism as other generations. He says nothing will ever replace language as the medium of thought, so nothing will replace the well-written, originally reported story or the well-reasoned essay. That's kind of a long-winded introduction to his new book, which is titled Way 1968, about what's generally considered to be a pivotal battle in the Vietnam War. I highly recommend it. Bowden examines the battle through interviews with participants on both sides, as well as contemporary media coverage and subsequently written secondary sources. We'll be talking today about some of the leadership lessons we can draw from some of the episodes in this book. Tom, where do you want to start?
Well, Richard, first of all, let me start by thanking you for turning me onto the book and echoing your sentiments. It's just an excellent book. I also read Black Hawk Down, very much a debacle, and Way certainly cost more lives. But in the American mythos, I think Way actually has a larger place because many people believe it was the psychological turning point in the war when the everyday American citizen back home began to at least suspect that we were not going to win the war, and that the propaganda and information that the government had released was not equivalent to what was going on the ground. And
Entirely truthful.
Well, there perhaps was a credibility gap, was the phrase used to believe in the 60s. And we're going to talk about kind of that at the end. And I really just wanted to have the opportunity to explore this with you from the leadership perspective. And I'd really thought about it in three distinct different phases that we could talk about, kind of the before the battle, the during the battle, and after the battle. And if that might be a framework that we could use, because I found leadership lessons in all of those. First of all, in the before, I had the Battle of Quezon Son is just burned in my memory for reasons that are now shrouded in mist. Nevertheless, Quezon was at its peak, I think, in the fall of 1967, and Quezon was a U.S. outpost at the far end of the Central Highlands, fairly close to the Laotian border. And Westmoreland, the U.S. General Westmoreland, had decreed that Quezon would be there and it would not fall, and was under pretty much 24/7 continuous attack by the North Vietnamese. And so two things about Quezon, I think, impacted the thought process around the Battle of Hue. The first one was, and I think you may be able to talk a little bit more in depth on this, was that to actually invade Hue was a huge logistical effort. Not only did they have to bring troops down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but they also had to bring supplies in all forms down the trail, and they had to get them past Quezon while actively attacking Quezon every day. So logistically, it was a huge effort by the North Vietnamese, both the regular army and the Viet Cong within the South. The second thing was that it led to many of the decisions, erroneous decisions, I think, were made in the early phases of the Tet Offensive and the Battle of Hue, that the Tet Offensive was a diversion to draw U.S. attention away from Quezon. And that's how General Westmoreland saw it. and it turned out not to be true. So logistically, we saw, at least in my mind, failures in foresight from the U.S. Military Command, recognizing that a buildup was going on. There is no logistical buildup that ever happens in a vacuum. The Russians knew the Germans were building up before they attacked. The Germans knew the Russians were building up before they counterattacked. You always know someone's building up. That, I recognize, it does not give you the insight into when an attack may occur. But when you have troops on the ground reporting something is going on, from a risk assessment perspective, you need to assess that risk. And you need to try to determine what the possible outcomes could be so you could manage that risk going forward. If you overlay that with the absolute rosy picture that General Westmoreland was painting at the time, indeed in 1967 he went on an end of the war tour and really claimed that not just prosperity was just around the corner, but the war was almost over. And this was really only two plus years after heavy American increased involvement in the war. So I thought it was really striking to me, one, just the massive logistical effort that the North Vietnamese actually were able to pull off, but also the absolute failures in foresight by the high American command. So,
well, I think Khe San's an interesting battle to bring up. I never have really understood it. As near as I understand it, the concept was really sort of the fall of the French at Dien Bien Phu had basically ended the French possession of Indochina. And Westmoreland was set up Khe Sanh almost in defiance of that lesson, as a way of showing that this would not happen to the U.S. by putting an exposed fire base in the middle of nowhere, which served virtually no strategic purpose that I could tell.
In a valley.
Yeah.
In a valley. Yes, to all the above.
Okay.
I think actually his purpose was, in addition to what you had articulated about Dien Bien Phu and parallels there, but it was to try to irritate the North Vietnamese, try to put something close to the Laotian border and the Ho Chi Minh Trail that, if given the authority, he could then actually interdict on. And perhaps he envisioned not just troops, but also some sort of aerial missions to try to interdict on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He never, I don't think, ever got formal approval to do that from Lyndon Johnson, although obviously Nixon later invaded Cambodia, but that was much later and really not a part of this story. So before the actual Tet Offensive in the Battle of Hue, just dramatic mistakes by the U.S. High Command.
Yeah, and a U.S. Navy analyst after the war called the run-up to the Tet Offensive a logistical miracle. And Bowden points out that it's only possible for this to have happened and for it to have been kept secret if people in the countryside actively supported it or didn't care. He leaves out a third possibility, which I think is also relevant, which is that they could have been intimidated into silence. But in any event, what warnings there were completely ignored. But the warnings were fairly few. They actually did a brilliant job of setting it up in secrecy, and their initial success was just phenomenal.
Yes.
In fact, the description is that Bowden says is surprise achieved in Hue was complete. It's not a case of simply being caught off guard. It's so unexpected it triggered not just alarm, but disbelief, deadly disbelief. And it led to completely ignoring reports from the field that contradicted their initial rosy opinion. I think there's some real leadership lessons there in the effect a setback can have on the psychology of someone. In the case of Westmoreland, it simply hardened his opinion that everything was going fine.
Indeed, it did, and we're going to have a lot to unpack when we talk about the actual battle itself. But the Marines on the ground told and communicated to their commanders that this was not just a probing attack This was not just a company or two of locals who had infiltrated and taken over a building or two. This was a major attack by a large number of troops. And if I can find it here, I think the second day there were 4 Marine companies that had been fed into Way, and as Bowden claimed, they got creamed. It was clear enough to them that the city was in enemy hands, and taking it back was going to be hell. At one point, the commander of Task Force X-Ray from regional headquarters had said there might be a few platoons of enemy, and the Marine captain rebuked him with, hell, we've got an entire platoon of NVA dead on the wire. So when you have that many dead, it's a pretty good sign that something different is going on. And the initial response was that the South Vietnamese could take care of this. It was a South Vietnamese problem. This was really their city. Way was the ancient capital of the Vietnam, I think, before the French took it over. Many critical Buddhist shrines and temples there, which were a whole other issue, came up from all of that. But the ARVN were just absolutely overwhelmed. And then, of course, you have the quality of the ARVN soldiers at that point. So initially, it was a not only huge setback, but you had the high command in Saigon and even down the road in Pleiku not believing the information from the eyes on the ground Marines.
Well, and in fact, Westmoreland's initial report to the Joint Chiefs was off by a factor of 20 on the number of Vietnamese in Way. And your point about the historic importance of Way, it did lead to the fact that the Marines were initially, and for most of the battle actually, denied the ability to use artillery and air support in order to avoid damaging the historical monuments, which led to hundreds of American deaths. They were probably unnecessary.
So I'd like to read a quote that Bowden set forth about the first Sunday of the attack from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And this ties into the point we were talking about with Khe Sanh. It's found at page 230 in the book. It's quite clear that the military objective of the attack has not been achieved. It was to divert U.S. troops and South Vietnamese troops from the probable offensive action of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese around Khe Sanh. And even after the city was overrun, they still saw this as a diversion around Khe Sanh. And this is with Marines on the ground talking about trained NVA soldiers, not Viet Minh or Viet Cong coming forward. So the failures of leadership, I really hadn't thought about the psychological impact of just being knocked in the jaw. But the Marines knew one thing, and the Marines knew take the hill. And that's what they did. And when they reported back they couldn't take the hill because of simply overwhelming firepower, that was dismissed to the point where I think some commanders were afraid to push back too far.
Yeah, and that's one of Bowden's points that I thought was really interesting about the lower level leadership as opposed to the leadership in the upper echelons. The Marines did prove fairly adept at improvisation, as they usually do. They also, on occasion, simply ignored orders. There was one instance where there was a sniper in a spire, and although the tanks had been ordered not to fire their main guns in the city, the commander of the tank simply shot the top off the spire and then called asking for permission, which was then denied. So the other thing they did was, although they weren't allowed to use artillery, one of the Bowden's heroes in this book is a man named Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham. He pulled all the old Korean War era bazookas and recoilless rifles out of storage, which were artillery by any name except it was just a very creative interpretation of his instructions that he used those, and that's actually how they ended up being able to retake the city.
So from the during the battle itself, did as I recall, Creighton Abrams took actual field command. I may have that wrong. It may have been just him coming to the front. but the tone greatly seemed to change when Abrams was there. Did you sense that as well?
Yeah, Abrams was certainly more clear-eyed about what was going on. He acknowledged that they had been caught by surprise, and let's see, where was that? That was there was a part where he was talking to Cronkite and basically just correctly pointed out that Westmoreland was simply either delusional or lying to them. He spoke about their complete tactical surprise, the magnitude of the impact on the troops, and the scope of the enemy's accomplishments. This is a guy who fought in Battle of the Bulge in World War II.
And led troops in Korea after the Chinese invasion. So,
yeah.
Yes, he was not one to hyperpole. He certainly was able to assess the situation. And I thought his clear-eyed view it certainly changed the tone. And that really leads us, perhaps now to the after action.
Let's go back to Abrams for a moment, because one of the other things about him that struck me was he sought out lower-level commanders to talk to him.
Right.
So he was the only one who was actually listening to people who had been experienced the street-level fighting. And I think that led to his more accurate appraisal. And you pointed out that the Marines pushed back, but as Bowden says, part of being a leader is being able to push up as well as down. If you knew more because of where you were and what you saw, then you stood your ground. You didn't just protest. If need be, you refused. And there was one instance later in the battle when the higher commands tried to replace a major who had, in their opinion, failed, in part because they had refused to allow him the tools he needed. And the colonel who was supposed to replace him refused and said he would resign before he would do it. At that point, the order was conveniently forgotten and subsequently ignored. So there was this whole up-down tension in the leadership ranks that I think Creighton was the one who kind of got around it. Creighton Abrams, for what it's worth.
So we also talked about in the, if not misinterpretation of events or facts, the outright denial of reality, the individual NBA or Viet Cong soldiers. And I think we both recognize that they had a different political tradition. They had different motivations. They were very motivated cadres who probably, I would have assumed, knew they were on a suicide mission. Nevertheless, they actually believed, or at least if you listen to Ken Burns on Vietnam, that the leaders at that time had told them that there would be a spontaneous uprising by South Vietnamese literally across the country during the Tet Offensive. That did not happen in any way, shape, or form. But what did happen was the outright massacre, I think, of up to 6,000 citizens, South Vietnamese citizens of Hue, deemed undesirables by the North Vietnamese. And typically in a war, when you execute a large number of civilians, it really firms up the civilian resistance and really hardens that resistance. I'm not sure we ever saw that in South Vietnam. And maybe that goes to your point, which you raised earlier about the intimidation. And we never saw the, not individual South Vietnamese, we did see that. But we really never saw the population just step back and say, no, we're not going to be pawns where we're going to be shot by people coming across our houses.
Yeah. Well, I think in our discussions before this podcast, you pointed out that the vast majority of the citizens of South Vietnam really didn't take sides. They just wanted to be left alone. And I think in part they didn't trust either of the powers fighting. They didn't trust the communists. They didn't trust whether you regard it as the puppet government or the legitimate government of South Vietnam is pretty much irrelevant. They simply didn't think that either one had their best interest at heart. And I think that was probably a pretty good appraisal on their part.
One thing we never seem to have understood in the United States was that the government of South Vietnamese was really a minority of a minority because it was largely Catholic within a much larger Buddhist country. And many of the problems which led to the direct American involvement were from the treatment of the South Vietnamese leadership to and against the Buddhists, which I think enraged the individual citizens of Vietnam. But we had, whether or not they were whether you want to call them a puppet regime or not, they seem to be the antithesis of the normal or the average Vietnamese citizen, contributing to all of these problems. So you posed a question to me before, which was, I think, was the turning point militarily of the war. And, I'm not sure we had a military turning point, but what I do believe is the way was psychologically for the United States the turning point. And the reason it was psychologically the turning point is for people listening to this podcast under the age of 60, you may not understand that this was the first war that we watched over dinner. Literally every night at 5:30, ABC, NBC, and CBS had live or video reports from Vietnam, and that's when we watched national news. Local news was at 6. So if you ate an early dinner, you could watch it. If not, you had to watch it during dinner. And this was when it changed. Was when it became clear that the messages that the general American public, Joe Q. citizen, was getting from our generals and from our politicians was not what was happening. And there was I think one of the key turning points psychologically was when Walter Cronkite went to Hue near the end of the battle and reported from Hue. And his assessment, I'm going to read this because I found it clear-eyed. I'm sorry I don't have the page number, but it read in part, to say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of evidence, the optimists have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. On the off chance that military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case it is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as honorable people who have lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did so the best they could. Bowden notes after this quote, after watching Cronkite's editorial report, President Lyndon Johnson is purported to say, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. But what struck me, Richard, was the assessment of Cronkite, not that we had lost. It was to say that if you are a hardened or extreme optimist, nothing's changed. If you're a pessimist, then we've lost and we have to leave now. He correctly says we're in stalemate. Yep. And that's where we were. And it turns out that's where we had been for quite some time. So, and then goes on to suggest that negotiations are best when you're in stalemate. So that, to me, was really the clear-eyed assessment. It wasn't that we could never win. He didn't say that. He didn't say we've lost. He simply said we were in stalemate. And the United States at that point did not have the political will because politicians did not have the political capital to move us to have the political will to move past stalemate. So very long-winded answer to your question, perhaps, but I really found that to be the key lesson from, or key outcome of Hue.
Well, and I think in terms of the leadership lesson, one of the things you can say is what were they trying to lead America towards? And can you really articulate what their goal was? And was it ever achievable? I think if it was a unified Vietnam under a democratic regime, it was never even in the cards. If it was sort of a stalemate like we've maintained on the Korean Peninsula for the last 65 years, maybe that was possible. But that's a hard sell.
Well, I actually debated this with my father quite a bit. And we both felt that at that time, both with Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, as Democrats particularly, they had to be seen as hard on communism. Mm-hmm. The China lobby was very active and vigorous. I think the Republicans were viewed as more vigorous against fighting communism. And I had always thought it was just we would go anywhere to fight communism. And unfortunately got stuck in the jungles of Vietnam and got brought to stalemate. But as far as I could tell, that was really our only strategic goal.
Yeah. Well, and it's still hotly debated whether Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist or a hardline Stalinist. I think his apologists claim that he was simply a misunderstood Vietnamese nationalist. I think the evidence is pretty good against that, but that's a little beyond the scope of this podcast. But yeah, I think one of the things about leadership is you do have to know where you're going, and what your goal is, and especially in military leadership where you're ordering people to give up their lives. So anyway, I think it's a great book. I think there's a lot to learn from it, and it's certainly a much more in-depth coverage of a very interesting battle in a very long war.
I found a lot of lessons. I learned a lot of new information. I guess, Richard, the overriding lesson for me was that you have to listen to the eyes on the ground. And you don't have to believe it unskeptically, but you have to listen to that, and you have to listen to the information. You have to take the input from your internal control systems, which in the military are the people on the ground, and help them use that information critically to evaluate in a fair, rational, and accurate assessment. And that's, I guess, from the leadership perspective, the one thing I wanted to try to emphasize in this podcast today.
Well, the other thing I got was the incredible power of denial. That famous Mike Tyson quote, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth."
Right.
Well, I think that's kind of what happened to Westmoreland here. And he was simply unable to adjust his view to facts that he did not want to see. And I think as a leader, that's really something to look out for.
That's a great point.
Stop trying to fit the world to your preconceptions.
Well, Richard, it was a great book. It was a great read. Not unpleasant, but I think lots of lessons that Americans need to consider today on a variety of different areas.
I agree. So thank you for listening. And for now, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox with 12 O'Clock High.
This is Paris Fox again. We hope you enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and rate the podcast. Thank you for listening.